Hi everyone, can you hear me? Great. Nice to meet you. My name is June, and today I'll help you guide you through IB English Lang&Lit Paper One sample commentary. Our goal with this lecture is not only to have you comprehend these texts on a surface level, but I want to encourage you and guide you through being able to form a coherent analysis of these texts. How these two authors are achieving different purposes with different rhetorical devices towards their target audiences specifically. We have text A and B. So text A, it seems like is an infographic titled Digital Nation UK 2023, right? It's an infographic by what also seems Good Things Foundation, right? So we'll walk through what that, entails. Text B, quite a hefty text might add from parts like these and introducing real estate like these forms, etc. It seems like this is an effective real estate advertisement, right? For apartment, it seems 114 by real estate company titled High Tor. But before we go into each of the texts in detail, we can clearly see how both text A and B kind of have aims to persuade their audiences, respective audiences, but they do so, as we can see from the vastly different structure and the visuals. They have vastly different genres and techniques, right? Text A, it seems from the fact that it's from a foundation, it's a socially driven infographic that, seems to visualize almost the problem of digital exclusion here, right, in the UK, while text B is we'll have to go through this one by one, but kind of a lifestyle-driven real estate advertisement, right? And as we can see from the tone and the fact that this is an advertisement, right? Um, it's an advertisement that is designed to kind of sell a luxury apartment in Perth, right? And what we're going to do is kind of we should be able to analyze each text chronologically, right? From the top to bottom, and we should be able to kind of try and examine how these text structure, use of language, and tone kind of all serve together. That's the point. All serve together to reinforce their respective purposes. And we'll start with the opening sections. And also feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, if you have confusions on certain parts. So on the top of text slate, let's look at this. So we see the title Digital Nation UK 2023, but what we see is that title is immediately followed by the subtitle, Facts and Stats to Fix the Digital Divide for Good. What does this do? What do you think? I would say this sets a clear, reformist purpose, right? Immediately frames the entirety of the text because usually the title is what you read the first, what you read first. It frames the entire text as a data-driven appeal towards what? Social equity, right? And we have this accompanying visual of a split digital landscape, right? So we have this river crossing and it's quite split in between this kind of, desert-like bleak area and the, revived green area almost. So one half is barren and disconnected, and the other half is like lush and digitally included, right? It really strengthens this framing, initial framing that we talked about with a stark kind of visual metaphor of the core idea of inequality, right? And let's look at the opening of text B. Text B, let me read a little bit of the opening because text B opens quite interestingly with this luxurious and emotionally charged hook, right? Here we see in this part, right? Discover your ultimate sanctuary. This sophisticated two-bedroom apartment offers more than a mere dwelling. It presents an unparalleled lifestyle experience, and then it goes on with, enter and be impressed, etc., etc. What do you feel? What kind of emotion do you feel from this? Because in paper one, what's important is be able to understand, step into the shoes of the audiences, right? Because the author is targeting everyone who's reading this, right? And it's important to kind of go walk through the minds of the author, but also the minds of the audience. What impact is the author kind of creating in the audience? And what it does is, first of all, this tone is what adjectives would you use? I would say super grandiose and almost aspirational, right? Why? Because this is tailored to an audience of affluent potential buyers of this real estate, right? And we see super hyperbolic diction, right? We see like things like unparalleled, ultimate, these are also super grandiose, but what did these do? These contrast kind of sharply with kind of the urgent and factual tone that is that is exhumed by text A. So here we see this kind of a contrast of genre, but also kind of purpose that is served by their respective tone. As we move on to the mid section of text A, we see kind of different statistics, right? Statistics almost begin to dominate, right? We see here, 10.2 lack the most basic digital skills. We also see, um, oh yeah, so like statistics like 1 in 14 households have no home internet access, 2.5 UK households struggle to afford fixed broadband. These are quite, bleak, here these texts, these statistics kind of are bleak, but also these claims add logos, right? What is logos? Logical appeal, right? To the argument. With these statistics, the author is the designer is able to kind of ground its urgency in measurable impact, right? And visuals such as, arrows here, we see stick figures here, and a color-coded UK map here, all these create a layout that is accessible. That guides the reader's eye, right? So, okay, I'm supposed to, follow these series of information, and the infographic, as I mentioned above, is also kind of forming a contrast of the digitally excluded groups on the left, and non-users are, twice as more likely to be over 65 and have a disability, with the empowered, highly engaged users on the right, which exclude, 36 point million highly engaged users, 30 million, NHS app users. And this kind of contrast kind of allows a smooth comprehension of the reality, the stark reality of the British society where this kind of inequality exists, and the readers are able to kind of follow these information with an element of shock, right? Okay, or it's almost fosters a reflection, because the environment that the UK citizens live in probably don't look literally like this as the infographic, but with the streamlined kind of comprehension that the author allows with statistics, but also kind of a structure from left to right, from the excluded to the included, we are able to see the entire inequality in one frame, right? And that gives an element of shock, but that also gives an element of reflection, right? Oh, I didn't notice this, but we were really living in a society that's divided, right? This fosters kind of a looking back into what is actually happening in society, and with that kind of reflection, it's almost natural for the author to be able to kind of foster a call to action, and we'll kind of dive into that next step as we look at the latter portion of the text. So text B, but when we look at the middle section, develops kind of its own kind of persuasive tone to through element of like emotive imagery, and as well as I'll say spatial language, right? Like what are those? So we see phrases like, forever views of the Swan River, breath, perfectly positioned in on the 11th floor, breathtaking panoramic views of the sunrises. What do these lines, reinforce? These, I would say, reinforce a fantasy of the elevated, the visual luxury, and often literally in this case, right? Given the apartment's, height and as well as class, right? And there's a heavy emphasis on kind of the visual and the sensory experience, right? Which, appeals to the reader's imagination rather than intellect, right? And text B is also able to interestingly use architectural detail to establish credibility and the tone of, intricate craftsmanship, right? That they mentioned, let's look at those parts, um, let's see. There we go. So here, like custom design kitchen, Robin Hood ironing board, hidden kickboard drawers, your own wine rack even. What do these things do? These specific functions, you know, as ethos appeals, right? They're building trust by showcasing material quality and being able to directly imagine their lives. They're not walking into this idea of a home, but they're walking into a place that is clearly visualized to the audience so that they know what they're putting themselves into when they're making this huge investment. They know, they trust that these intricate details were preserved for them and they feel kind of tailored towards, which kind of builds an emotion of expectation, but also makes action easier, right? Because of the level of trust ethos. And in the later section of the text, it's interesting. In the lower half of text A, the focus shifts from kind of societal solutions. Sorry, the focus shifts towards societal solutions and benefits, right? We see, countless statistics here. We won't be able to go through everything, but in the latter half, we see elements such as, better for the UK, 13.7 billion pounds benefit, better for the planet, people with the high digital engagement, save, it seems 659 pounds more a year. This part really constructs a hopeful vision for the national progress, right? And we see, really quite, how should I say, optimistic phrases, right? There are benefits of being online, emphasizing collaboration, let's support government investment in digital skills training. The infographic, I think from the top, from these, information, reality, evoking part to these hopeful parts, what we see is kind of call to action, right? Supported by ethos, which is public institution like the NHS, but also kind of pathos because we see this happy, glee, digitally empowered citizens illustrated in green spaces, right? And it's almost like if we take action, we can become that. If we take action, we are able to do that. So instead of having this, kind of, I mentioned kind of element of shock in the beginning, but then what is shock to an audience? It freezes, right? It freezes the minds, it scares the minds. But what after that, by employing these flexible, emotive languages that are kind of optimistic, it softens the reader's hearts and it really allows the readers to imagine a future for the society that is problematic, given, but is has pathways to improve. And it's almost like persuading that those pathways are possible and also attainable, if that makes sense. Lastly, in text B, in the end, kind of shifts towards communal and practical incentives as a final third, I would say. It lists, let's see what kind of, it lists like barbecue area here, which and secure and lockable, sorry, bike store, herb garden here. These are pretty practical ones, but it really frames the whole complex as a self-contained lifestyle ecosystem, right? Does that make sense? This is also at list real benefits such as, we see reverse cycle here, air conditioning, intercom access here, um, rent appraised at $500 a week, right? So these are combining both emotional appeal of the of the fantasy life in this apartment, but also the functional justification, right? And what these kind of points culminate in the advertisement ends with kind of a persuasive push here because it ends with riverfront properties like this don't last long, contact Lee Smith. This imperative tone, right? It's not a suggestion, it's an imperative tone, right? And direct contact info obviously creates a sense of scarcity, right? And urgency, right? It's a classic sales tactic that is aimed at pushing the readers to immediate action because once we see this real information, real potential for contact, we suddenly feel like this place is attainable. Just like how in the infographic, the designer was able to kind of almost persuade the audience that hopeful future is attainable. It's a different context, but it ends with kind of a potential, functional justification of really being able to purchase this directly so that the audience doesn't just pass by, doesn't just end up fantasizing, but really putting fantasy into reality. They've installed all these, imaginary, peaceful, exclusive lifestyle. And, they have built all this, established imagination in their minds. And now the only thing they have to do is make a phone call or give a text to make this imagination into a reality. So they were able to kind of put kind of what they desire and then give them this strong option, imperative option to kind of make this into reality. So it's almost like giving power to the audience, but at the same time, the audience is somewhat persuaded at this point. And they kind of culminate their persuasion by making a contact just super reachable in this case. So, chronologically speaking, I think both texts kind of move from, framing and orientation, and in text A, divide and need for reform, text B kind of, aspiration and lifestyle, and through in the midsection, kind of detailed persuasion, we have seen data and as well as vivid description of the apartment in these parts, and really conclude with the broad call for action, right? There's a, hope for policy change that for the society that we desire, but also kind of this vivid description and the explanation of the benefits, right? But I would say while text A had been dependent on, logos and visual structure, given the text type of an infographic, I think text B had depended on, been dependent on pathos, right? Being able to rely on, the swirling emotion of potential homeowners, but also luxury language, right? One text had sought to include the public in a social movement, but the other had sought to exclude through explicitity and this tone of luxury, right? And with these strategies, what is common is that both texts had demonstrated how, purpose, shapes every stylistic choice of these texts from top to bottom in persuasion of the readers. So I've walked through each part of the text and kind of, walked through impact of each rhetorical device and how the authors were able to successfully really persuade these audiences. And please let me know if any of these rhetorical devices or analysis or author intent don't make sense. But yeah, that's it for the guided commentary. And please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.